I'd like to give a little bit of introduction about the book, and then I'll read a few short passages. But 14 years ago, I went to Laramie, Wyoming to write a screenplay for a made-for-television movie about the murder of Matthew Shepard. And when I went to Laramie, I went with the idea that I was going to write the story of the anti-gay hate crime as we all knew it. And what I knew at that point was really based on a lot of the media stories that had been done. When I arrived in Laramie, I met the prosecutor in the case who sent the two perpetrators away for 2 life sentences. His name is Cal Raruka. I met him early on when I began to go through court records and court transcripts, police reports, etc. What many people don't realize is that during the year-long case, all of the witnesses in the case were under a gag order, and all of the court records were sealed. So at the time the case was going on, journalists could not look through any of that material. I spent about 8 months doing a lot of interviews with the prosecutor, other interviews, and going through the official record, and I wrote a first draft of the screenplay. And I returned to Laramie. This was 8 months into my work, and I asked the prosecutor to read the first draft of the script and just to make notes in the margins and tell me if I had misstated anything or had anything inaccurate. And it was on a Saturday in October in Laramie. He took my screenplay to his office at the end of a corridor. I went the opposite way, and I sat in the law library there, where he had often conferred with Matthew Shepard's parents while the trials were going on. And I was going through some folders of clippings, news clippings, and also some court documents. But his mother, Cal Raruka's mother, had put together a collection of news clippings. And while I had my own collection at this point, mainly from the national media, but some Wyoming coverage, I wanted to be sure that there weren't articles from the local papers like the Laramie Boomerang that I had missed. So as I'm going through, thinking this would be my last research trip to Laramie, I came upon an anonymous letter, handwritten anonymous letter, written to the prosecutor, and it quickly became apparent that that letter was written either during Aaron McKinney's trial or after it ended. What you may remember is that the official story was Matthew Shepard was attacked, robbed, and murdered because he was gay. That there was a robbery that occurred, but the primary motive was homophobia. And I'll just read you just a bit of an introduction to this short letter. Although the letter had no date, I quickly realized it had been written during Aaron McKinney's trial the previous year. McKinney's lawyers had tried to present a so-called gay panic defense, arguing that an unwanted sexual advance by Matthew Shepard triggered memories of homosexual abuse McKinney had suffered at the age of 7, causing him to react violently. Like others who followed the case, I was infuriated by that legal strategy which sought to place the blame on the victim. The letter began, "Dear Mr. Raruka, I was shocked to hear that Aaron McKinney's attorneys claim gay panic in their defense. Aaron and Russell Henderson was the other perpetrator, were quite familiar with gay guys and have frequented gay bars. They became aware of the fact that they had a valuable asset in their pants and that gay guys would give them shelter, food, and money in return for a few minutes' pleasure. Even though Aaron was acting the part of straight trade, he was appalled that he really did like doing it with other guys. Aaron always felt guilty that he let another guy do him. His excuse was he was only doing it for the money to spend on his girlfriend. Aaron always questioned his own truthfulness as to why he was really doing it. Deep down inside, a small part of him really liked some homosexual action." These are my words. "I was aware by then that one of the alleged gay guys, whom the author identified as Thomas O'Connor, was a Laramie chauffeur that everyone knew as Doc, and that Doc O'Connor had also been a friend of Matthew Shepard. Doc was portrayed in several magazine stories as a folksy, somewhat eccentric, cowboy-like character who had befriended Matthew a few days before the attack, when Matthew hired a limo to take him to a Colorado dance club. Yet according to every news account I had read, Matthew had never met Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson before. They were strangers. So what I'd like to do is, I'm just going to read a few short passages. If you saw the HBO adaptation of the Laramie Project, Doc O'Connor was played by the actor Steve Buscemi. And the Doc O'Connor I came to know while Steve Buscemi, terrific actor, had Doc's voice down. There was a lot about the portrait that was inconsistent with the Doc O'Connor that I got to know. So I'm just going to read you a short passage about my first encounter with Doc O'Connor. This is from a chapter early on in the book, page 43, Doc's Frontier Village. Following the directions to Bosler, this is Bosler, Wyoming, it's about 18 miles north of Laramie. Following the directions to Bosler that Doc had given, I pulled off Highway 30 into a scrubby driveway that led to several outbuildings and trailers. Uncertain about where to go next, I dialed him on my cell phone. "Just pull in where I told you," a raspy male voice answered at the other end. "Park there on the left and come to the door right in front of you." Before I could respond, the connection went dead. The windows of the single-story building nearest me were covered with wrinkled shades. Some were torn and yellowed with age. No sign of life inside or anywhere else. I got out of the car slowly. Just then, a thick metal door on the side of the house opened, and Doc O'Connor's surly voice bellowed from within. "What's the matter? Can't you boys from back east follow instructions?" Seconds later, I stood with Doc, a craggy-looking man with a graying mustache and short ponytail, in a corner of his ranch-style bedroom where we faced a bank of video monitors and computer screens. Staring back at us were black and white surveillance pictures of my parked car outside from every possible angle. I tried to maintain a friendly composure, pretending not to be intimidated or even surprised. "Don't worry, you're safe here," Doc teased. "If anyone tries to get past these cameras, I've got my rifles." Studying his face and eyes, I could see that he must have been a knockout as a young man. During another visit with Doc, months later, as he nursed a rum and coke at his kitchen table, he confirmed as much when he pulled out a dusty, leather-bound album with photos taken in his 20s. Slowly, over several long, meandering conversations, he loosened up and spoke of things in his past he had long kept hidden. From his adventures performing in porn films and the glories of being paid big bucks for sex with Hollywood movie stars and a married bank president, to encounters with the infamous gangster Chauncey Smaldone and the Denver mob. "I was a hustler," Doc confessed unabashedly. According to Doc, he first met Aaron McKinney when Aaron was 16 or 17, one of several local young men with problems whom Doc took under his wing, though some in Laramie allege that his motives have not always been altruistic. In midsummer 1998, several weeks before Matthew's attack, Aaron, his girlfriend Kristen, and their infant son lived in an apartment on Doc's property in Bosler, rent-free. The arrangement they had was that Aaron would do odd jobs for him, Doc explained as he gave me a tour of the dim, windowless apartment situated in a huge warehouse across the road from his home. Many of my early interviews with Doc occurred in out-of-the-way places. Sometimes he would offer to take me out in one of his stretch limos for a drive, quote-unquote, for a drive out to the mountains, but I politely declined. He said he wanted to show me Centennial, Wyoming, a rustic town about 30 miles from Laramie, and Woods Landing, another remote spot where he'd driven Aaron and a few of his friends for parties in the limo. For a long time, Doc continued to say that he had just met Matthew a few days before the attack, and that he never saw Aaron and Matthew together. But as new sources began to tell me a different story, Doc's story began to change too. He acknowledged that Matthew had indeed visited him in Basler with his friend Alex Trout months before the murder, although Doc was quick to add, Matt didn't say very much, so I didn't really remember him. Doc also described a rowdy incident in the limo when Aaron and two unidentified male friends, with Aaron and two unidentified male friends, long before Matthew was killed. They dropped a couple of girls off at home first and told me to take them to Woods Landing, he recalled. I got paid to be the driver and mind my own business, which I always did, until I heard someone break a champagne glass in the back. I slid the window open and told Aaron he'd have to pay me for the glass. Doc stared at me, pausing for effect. The three guys were buck naked back there, playing around together. Aaron said, "No problem, Doc, I'll take care of it." I just shut my window and didn't say another word. Only after I questioned Doc intermittently over months did he concede Matt may have been one of the guys in back of the limo with Aaron. I can't say for sure. I also asked Doc numerous times about one of the many businesses he owned called Lincoln Escort Service. He answered with a straight face that it was a service to escort big trucks with heavy loads on the interstate. I told him that an escort service means something altogether different where I come from. But Doc stuck to that story, even after boasting that he had arranged to bring Denver-based female strippers to Wyoming to perform in a bar there. They call them exotic dancers now, but they do the same thing they've always done, he said with a cool shrug. I was reminded again of the anonymous letter I found at the courthouse long before, stating that Aaron was acting the part of straight trade, and his excuse was he was only doing it for the money to spend on his girlfriend. Did Doc run an escort service that employed young males like Aaron, and perhaps Russell too? And where did Matthew fit in Doc's schemes, if at all? What I thought was just an innocuous suggestion by Doc in an early interview would later lead me to a seedy hustler bar in Denver called Mr. Bill's, as well as a few other gay bars along the city's Broadway Strip. Those late-night excursions prompted me, in turn, to go back to Doc with more questions and more confusion. For reasons I did not understand, Doc had also divulged that shortly after Matthew's attack, he had hired a prominent defense attorney to represent him. If Doc had nothing to do with the murder, and Prosecutor Calwaruka had never brought charges against him, why did he need a lawyer? Each time I broached the subject, Doc deflected my questions by shifting to something else. "There are some things you'll never get me to talk about," he swore. Doc made no attempt to hide his fear that, quote, "someone might put a bullet in my back some night when I'm driving home from the Eagles, a Laramie fraternal club in which he'd been an active member and trustee for decades." He always drove into town and back home again on Highway 30, the same deserted Tulane County road that first took me to Basler to meet him in 2002. I'm skipping ahead here by about 100 pages in the book, but what I just read you just gives you a little bit of an idea of some of the sexual underworld that was beneath this story. And there was a lot more to it. What I discovered is that Aaron McKinney, the principal perpetrator, actually Matthew's killer who inflicted the violence on him, was bisexual, that he was a hustler, that he enjoyed having sex with other males, and there are a number of well-documented sources on the record named in the book who talk about those experiences. And I also learned that Aaron McKinney and Matthew Shepard had a personal friendship and relationship that existed months before this crime took place. All of the national media stated at the beginning that these guys were strangers. Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson were two rednecks who were strangers to Matthew, that they walked into a bar and targeted him because he was gay. And what I discovered was a very different story, that there was pre-existing discord between Matthew and Aaron. The other perpetrator, Russell Henderson, who did not commit the violence but drove the truck and was part of the robbery scheme, had never met Matthew before. I found no evidence over many years of investigation that he'd ever met Matthew Shepard before. So this is a very short chapter, chapter 19. It's called Sleeping Dogs. On a Friday afternoon in late October 2004, a little more than 6 years after the murder, I drove 200 miles to meet Kyle, a former drug cohort of Aaron McKinney, alone at an isolated truck stop off I-80 in western Wyoming. I had interviewed Kyle twice before in prison, and he had been surprisingly cooperative, so I felt more or less safe. Still, I took precautions, since he had earlier advised me, "You don't know who you're dealing with," referring to his friends higher up on the drug dealing food chain. Kyle worked in the oil fields and had just gotten off a shift. He was still in company overalls, his face and hands stained with crude. As we sat in the front seat of his parked car, talking about Matthew Shepard, whom he had previously claimed to know only in passing, I suggested that Matthew might have gotten in over his head with drugs. Kyle snarled at me like I was an idiot. Yeah, and he was taking stuff away from the rest of us. Without warning, two other vehicles suddenly backed into spaces on both sides of us, wedging us in. When I saw what was happening, I leapt from the car and ran into the middle of the parking lot where there were more lights. Kyle shouted for me to get back in the car, but I refused. At that instant, a friend of mine who was planted in a nearby truck monitoring the meeting called my cell phone. "Get out of there, Steve," he yelled. "They're setting you up." "Stay in your car, don't let them see you," I snapped back. Trying not to panic, but worried I would get run over or shot, I spun around several times to keep Kyle's car in view as I hustled across the parking lot to a truck stop restaurant. Before I reached the entrance, Kyle's vehicle and the other two tore out of the lot, tires screeching, heading for the ramp to the interstate. Seconds later, my friend picked me up in front of the truck stop, his face a sickly shade of white. In a halting voice, he told me how close he thought he had come to losing me there. I knew he was right. With his help, I had narrowly managed to escape, but clearly I had been given a message. Driving away from the truck stop, I took my friend's advice and crouched down on the floor of his truck out of sight. Evidently, someone more powerful than Kyle had set me up. I hardly slept that night in Laramie. Waves of anxiety surged through me till late the next morning. Why had I put myself in danger like that? The next day, still agitated, I related my roadside experience to Prosecutor Cal Raruka. He shook his head in disgust. "The methamphetamine trade has made Wyoming revert to the lawless anarchy of the Old West," he remarked pungently. "It's deadly." By then, Cal had been voted out of office in Albany County after 4 elected terms. He was now prosecuting state and federal drug cases in the Twin Cities of Rock Springs and Green River, the epicenter of methamphetamine traffic for the Rocky Mountain West. After hearing my story, Cal told me about a colleague, a Wyoming judge, who had recently been surprised by an armed male intruder in the bathroom of his home one morning while shaving. The man was there to relay a message regarding a drug case in which he was awaiting sentencing by the judge. After a few curt words, the man quietly slipped away. I saw no point in asking what the judge decided with a gun staring him in the face. But Cal's reference to the Old West brought back a conversation I'd recently had about Matthew's murder with a veteran cop in the Albany County Sheriff's Office. Friendly, with a studied, good old boy charm, the cop leaned over his desk toward me, his chiseled, wind-burned face inches from mine. "You sure you're not quoting me on this?" he asked. "It's for background. I won't be using your name," I answered, trying to sound reassuring. What happened to Matthew Shepard wasn't a hate crime. Not at all, he confided in a low voice. But why do you want to go digging into all that again? Why not let sleeping dogs lie? I wasn't inclined to answer his question candidly. Instead of laying out my suspicions about the involvement of other parties beyond Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson in events surrounding Matthew's murder. I reminded him that the killing was a seminal national event, a lot like the civil rights killings of the 1960s, as if he were somehow unfamiliar with the stigma that continued to tarnish his hometown. The public has a right to know whether the murder was really a hate crime, I said with conviction, and if not, what was it? The cop stared at me as he sank back from his desk, shrugging doubtfully. Almost as an afterthought, he flashed me another knowing grin, but again, his eyes told me to let sleeping dogs lie.
Wonderful. I'm going to start with a question and then have yours ready. So I was thinking through that process where we heard imagined experience, observed and direct experience, and journalistic portrayal of the experience, if we could shorthand it that way. But part of that diversity is that people can, when they decide to commit in writing, they pick a strategy or a tone, an approach. And I wonder if the authors could tell us how it is they came upon the strategy or approach or tone that they employ in their writing, and then we'll get to your questions.
My work on the Shepard murder went through many stages, but I began it, as I mentioned when I was reading, I began it as a screenplay, set the screenplay aside, did about a year of independent investigation, then sold the story to the New York Times Magazine, worked on that story for about 2 years. They killed it after 2 years, and within a couple of months, I took the story to ABC News 2020, and I produced an hour for television on the case. So my decision to write this work in the first person came in part from having done a television story that was, in a more conventional journalistic style. There were things that were left out of the ABC News story that we had, my producing partner and I had begun looking into. And so the decision really was that I wanted to do some more reporting on my own, with hopefully not a lot of censorship about the things I found, that I would have the opportunity to include those in a book, and my publisher turned out to be quite brave. But the strong personal factor was, being a gay man, I felt that telling the story of the journey of what I went to Laramie to write and what I believed, and that I ended up finding a different story, and why I felt that story was important to tell. So that's really how I came to the decision to write this, something in the style of an investigative memoir, narrative nonfiction, but in the first person.
Thank you. Who has the first question? I bet there's a lot. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I wanted to ask you, I had missed all the explanations of what really happened, and you indicated they were on TV. And
Yes.
Well, I missed them. So would you please tell me?
Do we need the mic? I'm sorry.
Sure. Do you remember is it on?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Do you remember the basic outlines of what the crime was?
What I basically knew was it was a homophobic hate crime.
Well, just the basic sketch is that two guys walked into a bar on an early October night in 1998. They were roofers, 21 years old, which was the same age Matthew was. They saw him there. He appeared to be well-dressed, looked gay, and that they targeted him for that reason and took him out and robbed, and in the course of it, Aaron McKinney beat him to death with the barrel of a .357 Magnum. You may remember that probably the most vivid image is of Matthew being tied to a fence on the prairie on the outskirts of Laramie. The story of what exactly happened, as I deconstructed the media accounts, there were many different versions. Initially, it was that they targeted Matthew. Then there was a story that was told that Matthew had made a sexual advance on them in the bar, and that it embarrassed and humiliated them, so they took him out to beat him up, to teach him a lesson not to come on to straight people. Then Aaron McKinney in his trial used yet another version, which was that 10 minutes after they left the bar, they were at the other end of town in a truck, and that Matthew reached over and grabbed him, and that caused him to explode. So there were many different versions. I will say that in the media reports, there were many, many inaccuracies. I remember finding in one paragraph of the Time magazine coverage 6 factual inaccuracies. Matthew Shepard's mom is on the record. She spoke a year after the crime and said he was never crucified to the fence, as many people described him hanging on the fence. He was actually sitting on the ground. His hands were tied behind his back to a fence post. But I remember seeing illustrations of the time of him, you know, literally hanging on the fence. And the article in Vanity Fair was titled "The Crucifixion of Matthew Shepard." But to just, in summary form, to say what I discovered is that there was, as I said earlier, discord between Aaron and Matthew. There had been a friendship between them. They had partied in the same social circle in Laramie, and they were both involved in the buying and selling of crystal methamphetamine, and they were involved with rival groups that were selling in Laramie, particularly in the bars. On the night in question, Aaron McKinney was looking for 6 ounces of methamphetamine, which he believed Matthew was going to have that night because of an incoming shipment. The meth was worth about $10,000 to $12,000 on the street, and that's what was driving McKinney. He had been up on meth for a week prior to the crime. I basically walked you through the days leading up to the crime and what was going on in the lives of these 3 men, and the tragedy that they were moving closer to in the days leading up to the crime.
I want to ask quickly, all of you, if you want to comment, part of all of your stories are difficult identities. And so this reminded you in your exposition of the difficult identities that were coming out of your investigation. The difficult identity of dying and how you relate to that, because you might be relating to your own experience of mortality through another's. And then the difficult identities that you might be exploring in a novel. So how do you approach in your work explaining difficult identities?
I don't know if I can answer that question, but in part, what I just want to respond to something, Laura, that you just said, which is that I agree with you, and as someone who came out in the 1970s, I am so happy about all the gains that we've made, but there's also an aspect of some of the spirit that is really kind of missing now as as things have become more normalized socially. And I have to laugh about your student who was 20, because my partner is 62, and he was married to a woman for 31 years, and they separated about a year and a half ago, and so it took him a long time. I mean, he certainly knew it for a while, but and I have a lot of gay male friends who have been married, who have kids, etc. So it's great that we can be more open and talking about these things, but I think there's a little bit more of a taboo now, not so much on sexual experimentation, but on the not knowing, or the fluidity of life experience. Anyway, that's one comment there.
Other questions? Yes?
I wanted to ask, is there anybody else besides you who has tried to get the true story out?
I'm going to repeat the question just in case. The question was, had other investigators approached the topic that Mr. Jimenez had approached?
Actually, in terms of journalism, no. There's one exception, but this was very early on. There was an author, journalist Joanne Vipajeski, who wrote a piece at the time the case was going on for Harper's Magazine, and it was a really good piece. And in fact, she ended up helping me, gave me some information, leads that I could follow through with. At the time she published her article, the gag order was still in place. Aaron McKinney's trial had not happened yet, and there were a lot of witnesses and people that she couldn't talk. There were also, the documents were sealed. But what she did do is she gave me some information that I could follow. There has not been another major nonfiction book on the murder case. And in terms of television, the only major report was this 2020. There was something that was in a lighter documentary style, I think, for A&E, their American Justice series. But in terms of books, there haven't been. The Laramie Project, which began as a stage presentation, is probably the work on the Shepard murder that is most widely known.
Okay, and that's based on the original?
It's based on the original, and also Matthew is not a significant character in the Laramie Project. There are a few characters that talk about him, but he's not directly portrayed. And one of the reasons that I felt it was important to write a book is that as I went through the major magazine articles and newspaper articles and everything, it was the same short, basic set of facts repeated about Matthew all the time. He went to boarding school in Switzerland, he spoke 3 languages, he was a good dresser, but it was the same, set of descriptions, so I was very curious about who Matthew was as a human being, and I was fortunate for the book that 2 very close friends and lovers. One, I include some of his journal entries from when they first met in college, and also include quite a bit from the other friend. But it was important for me to try to really get a sense of who Matthew was as a human being and what it was he suffered from.
Because it's just hard for me to believe it's been so many years, and the true story is now just getting out.
Well, it's interesting. I actually think that this book, I probably couldn't have published this book unless it was self-published 5 to 10 years ago. I think it really took the passage of time for people to be able to tolerate a more complex story. But there was it was not just an official media narrative, but it was one that, it was a seminal moment in the country when people became really aware of violence against gay people. And so I think offering a different story and filling in some of the colors, again, I think it required the passage of time.
When did this happen?
This happened in October of 1998. The case went on for a year. McKinney was convicted in early November of 1999.
And this might be our last question.
Okay. I'm just surprised all these years. I've probably seen everything on Matthew Shepard, and including the 2020, but now that I'm thinking about it, I don't remember it being characterized as anything but a homophobic crime. So I'm really surprised to hear that, and I want to buy your book. I'm surprised to hear the twist, I guess, or irony that he was a drug pusher. And that's what the case involved? Is that what I'm understanding?
Yes, but I just want to say, because I don't want to reduce Matthew to just a person who sold drugs.
Gotcha.
He was a young man who struggled with a lot of issues, as a lot of young people do.
Sure.
But again, the initial media reports made it like these 3 kids, because they were kids then, were from 2 different sides of the tracks. And Matthew came from one side, and these were the bad kids from the trailer park side. And what I discovered is no, they were, particularly with Aaron McKinney, they were part of the same social circles. I interviewed a number of their friends. So you are right in the way the crime was originally characterized, including even before Matthew died at the hospital, President Bill Clinton was encouraging passage of a hate crime bill that was stalled in Congress, which had many reasons. The attack on James Byrd in Texas had just happened four months before Matthew, but there was a lot of political weight in this case as well. But I think what you're saying about what you heard at the time is true.
So we want to thank our authors. We want to invite them to hold up your books, and some are for sale in back. We invite you to do this evaluation because if it's this color, it has to be important. And we're so glad that you were here today, and please enjoy the festival.